Good morning, and thank you so much to the members of the press who have joined us today for this press briefing on the important public health topic of PFAS, COVID-19, and vaccine efficacy. Earlier this year, the Centers for Disease Control expressed concern about the intersection between PFAS exposure and COVID-19. Earlier this month, we learned that the CDC, as part of the study on frontline healthcare workers, will be measuring PFAS blood serum levels to better understand how PFAS influences COVID-19 severity and vaccine efficacy. We want to emphasize that everyone should get vaccinated against COVID-19 as soon as a vaccine is available to them. It is also important, however, to answer the questions raised by the CDC to ensure that people who have been highly exposed to PFAS are adequately protected. So we have three experts here today to brief you on the state of the science. Dr. Linda Birnbaum is the former director of the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program. Dr. Jamie DeWitt is an associate professor of pharmacology and toxicology at East Carolina University, where she runs a research lab focused on environmental contaminants and their effect on public health. She is an expert on PFAS chemicals and immunotoxicology. And Dr. Tasha Stoiber is a senior scientist with the Environmental Working Group. Each expert here today will speak briefly, and then there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. To ask a question, we ask that you use the participant sidebar where you will be able to raise your hand if you have a question. Or if you want, you can use the chat function to send a question to me. And we ask that you stay on mute unless you are speaking. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Dr. Linda Birnbaum. Linda, thank you for joining us today.
Melanie, are you showing the slides or do you want us to show them?
I can if you would like me to.
I think that would be faster and better.
Okay.
If you can pull them right up. So let me just say thank you all for coming, and I'm always happy to answer some questions. What I'm really here to do is to give you some of the big pictures. I think everyone probably on this call already has a little bit of familiarity with PFAS, but I would like to tell you a few more things and kind of the plethora of effects that PFAS cause. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay. Thank you. So if we talk about what are per polyfluoroalkyl substances, I think they really, what I'm going to say right now is they are everywhere. There are over 9,000 of these chemicals that have been intentionally synthesized. There are many more that are produced from transformation in the environment or even metabolism to give you different kinds of PFAS. A point that I'll make right now is that the carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds that exists. It barely exists in nature. There are no easy ways to break it down or get rid of it. So you make a transformation of or partial breakdown of some polymers or of other compounds, but you will still end up with a per polyfluorinated substance going forward. There are many, many different products, as I've said, and impurities and degradants, and I think we're all familiar with Teflon and with Scotchgard and with the aqueous film forming foams, the AFFF, but there are many unknown formulations. All of these are used, they're very useful compounds. They provide resistance to grease, water, and oil. They can exist as and be used for surfactants and stain repellents, and the AFFF has been used repeatedly and heavily for fire suppression. I've mentioned that these chemicals are persistent and accumulative, but they are also mobile. So in fact, they are all over the world, including, for example, in the Arctic and in critters in the Arctic, where it's never been intentionally used or certainly not produced. Now, the PFOS and the PFOA, which are on the right of your screen and are giving you, those are what we call the legacy compounds, because industry voluntarily agreed in the US just to stop producing them between basically 2002 and 2015. I should say, however, that they're still out there. The Chinese are still making them, and they can still be produced by breakdown of others. What what industry has switched to is what we call the short chains, and there are thousands of these. The one that you may have heard the most about is something called Gen X, which has led to pollution of the entire Cape Fear River system in North Carolina, potentially highly exposing over 1 million people in the central part of North Carolina. There has been limited testing done of these short chains, but the important thing is that when they're tested, the few that have been studied, we see the same effects as the long chains. Next slide, please. So how are we exposed? Well, again, these are a very diverse group of chemicals. In fact, there are more than 200 use categories for these chemicals, including not only products such as carpets and fabrics and food papers, pots and pans, clothing, cardboard packaging. We've already talked about the AFFF, but also things like they can be present in pesticides. They can be present in cosmetics. They can be present in lots of other personal care products and household uses. They are a major contaminant in drinking water as well as surface and groundwater in certain areas. And there are all the routes of human exposure. You can ingest them from drinking water or food or dust. You can inhale them, and you can also have some dermal exposure to these compounds. Essentially, everyone in America have measurable PFAS in their body, and in fact, they are all over the world. Next slide, please. And why do we care about these chemicals that will never go away? Well, we care because, in fact, they cause a plethora of adverse health effects. They cause effects, for example, on our endocrine system. So, for example, they impact our thyroid, they impact our immune system, and we're going to hear a lot more about that in a few minutes. They are toxic to the liver and the kidney. They are also impact the pancreas and are associated with an increased risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes. We find that they impact our reproductive organs. They appear to be neurodevelopmentally toxic and affect the developing brain, and they do cause cancer. It's quite clear that they're highly associated with cancer in kidney and testis, but we also see it in a number of other organs. A point that I would like to make is that we not only see these effects in observational human studies, but in fact, we see essentially all of these effects in our animals, our model systems that we study. So when you have effects in animals, when you have effects in cell culture systems from human and animals, and you see effects in people, it is likely that the PFAS are the cause of some of these adverse effects. Just briefly on the immune system, my national toxicology program released in 2016 a systematic review, which concluded that the legacy PFAS, the PFOA and the PFOS, were immunotoxic. And I believe that Dr. DeWitt will be telling us more about that. So thank you.
And Melanie, I'll go ahead and share my slides. So I made some slight modifications to the ones that I shared with you earlier. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you so much for taking some of your time today to listen to us talk about PFAS and their effects on the immune system. This is especially important as the COVID vaccine rolls out. I want to tell you a little bit about my definition of immunotoxicity, and really this is a definition of immunotoxicity for the immunotoxicological community. So the normal role of the immune system is to protect us from pathogens. They help to kill mutated cells that might become cancerous. It helps to keep rogue immune cells that might attack our own tissues from attacking our own tissues. It dampens responses to, for example, proteins that we need for food, and it doesn't usually respond to innocuous things in the environment like dander from pets or pollen from plants. But it really does play a critical role in our physiology. It does much more than what I've listed out right now. But sometimes normal immune function can veer away from what's considered to be normal. If the immune system can't rise to a particular challenge, it's considered to be suppressed. If the immune system goes way overboard, it's considered to be overly stimulated. Somebody with an autoimmune disease, for example, has an overly stimulated immune system. Those rogue immune cells that recognize our own bodies start to attack our own bodies. If somebody has allergies or asthma, that means that the immune system is responding too strongly to those things in the environment to which it shouldn't respond. And if the immune system really isn't responding as strongly as it should to a pathogen or a vaccine, we consider the immune system to be suppressed. When chemicals lead to these changes in the immune system and these changes in immune function, we consider them to be immunotoxicants. PFAS that have been studied for their effects on the immune system are considered to be immunotoxicants. As Dr. Birnbaum mentioned, the National Toxicology Program evaluated studies of the effects of PFOA and PFOS on the immune system. They reviewed published studies of people where they were exposed through their work, through their drinking water, or through general sources. They reviewed studies of experimental animals given PFOA or PFOS. They even looked at studies of wildlife. They looked at studies of cells. And after evaluating all of these studies, these are some of the findings that they identified in human studies and in animal studies. But after evaluating all of these studies, they determined that the strongest evidence was for the ability of PFOA and PFOS to suppress the vaccine response in people. And this was supported by suppression of this response in experimental animals. Now, we don't vaccine animals that we use for experiments in the same way we vaccinate people, but we do give them antigens that produce a response that's just like the response that our bodies make when we get vaccinated. Some of these other immune effects were seen, and some of these other immune effects are evidence that the immune system goes overboard. We do have evidence that other PFAS that have been studied also have effects on the immune system. In fact, immunotoxicity has been observed for all of the PFAS that have been studied for their ability to affect the ability of the immune system to function. Well, what does this mean? Some people who are exposed to PFAS will end up having suppressed immune systems. Some people who are exposed to PFAS will end up having immune systems that go overboard. These people might get sick more often, some might not, but all people who have these effects on their immune systems after PFAS exposure will have a higher risk of developing diseases compared to people who don't have these effects on their immune systems. So if we look at some of the evidence that's been accumulated for PFAS, a group, the Pachowski et al. Group from 2019, asked what level of PFAS in the body is acceptable. In other words, what level of PFAS in the body should not be associated with any changes to the immune system. And they determined that that was 22.5 nanograms per mil of PFAS in the blood. This is considered to be, right now, a protective level. If you're exposed at or below this level, it's anticipated that immune effects won't arise. But there are people here in the United States from their work, from their drinking water, from other sources of exposure who do have concentrations in their blood of PFAS that are higher than this 22.5 nanograms per mil. Does it mean that they will all get sick? No, but it does mean that they have a higher risk of getting sick, especially if their immune system is challenged again. So in the case of COVID, what does this mean specifically? It may mean that there are some people who are at greater risk of developing COVID if they're infected, or they are at greater risk of developing disease if they're infected. It also means that they might have a more severe reaction if they are infected. Dr. Philippe Grandjean and his colleagues recently asked about this particular connection. They asked about levels of PFAS in blood from people in Denmark who also had been infected with COVID and experienced outcomes. What they found is that a particular PFAS known as PFBA, and it's depicted here, it's sort of like PFAS except with 4 carbons instead of 8 carbons. What they found is that in people who had higher levels of PFBA in their blood, they had more severe reactions to COVID. They stayed in the hospital longer, they ended up in the ICU, and unfortunately for some, they passed away more often as well. There are many scientists throughout the United States and across the world currently asking additional questions about COVID and PFAS. So what we understand then about COVID and PFAS on the immune system is that people with higher levels of PFAS in their blood are at increased risk of immunotoxicity. This may increase the risk of a more severe COVID reaction, as Dr. Grandjean and his colleagues reported. It may also increase the risk of a reduced response to the COVID vaccine. This is a real risk that does exist. Scientists like me are concerned because we want all people to be protected and to have a healthy and fully functioning immune system. We want people to be protected against COVID and other pathogens. But even though we know that some people have concentrations of PFAS, such as PFOS, that are immunotoxic, we still want people to get vaccinated because that vaccine is going to give your immune system an additional tool to fight COVID and with other vaccines, other types of pathogens. So it's like giving somebody who's fighting a battle a weapon. They might not be physically fit, but at least they have that weapon, and that's going to give them a chance in their battle against COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. DeWitt. And our last speaker is Dr. Tasha Stoiber, Senior Scientist with EWG.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all again for joining us. I don't have slides, so I'll just jump right in. I just wanted to summarize and add a little bit more detail to the great information and presentations that we just heard. So we know from studies in people and laboratory animals that the immune system is especially vulnerable to PFAS exposures, as you've just heard. And in the context of this pandemic, PFAS in your body, it may not only affect your risk of developing severe illness from COVID, but as you've heard, it could also affect your body's response to a vaccine. I want to stress again that it will be critical for as many people as possible to be vaccinated to end the pandemic. And it might be important for those that do have higher PFAS in their bodies to be prioritized to be vaccinated because they do have this increased risk of severe illness. Even if they have a suppressed response, as Dr. DeWitt has said, this is a really important tool. The vaccine will be a really important tool for your body. From the CDC's biomonitoring data, we know that nearly every American already has PFAS in their body. Military personnel, firefighters, and people in communities where contaminated drinking water has been found, all of these groups may have higher levels of PFAS in their body. And we know that PFAS exposure early in life can impact your immune system when it's developing, but it's also ongoing and current exposures that can also harm the immune system in adults. Men tend to have higher levels of PFAS compared to women, and PFAS accumulates in your body over time. It's also important to note that these are both the same risk factors, being male and older age groups, that could put you at greater risk for severe illness. As Dr. Birnbaum has said, exposure from PFAS comes from multiple sources, including the products we use, the dust in our homes, food packaging, food or drinking water. And drinking water can be an important source, especially in industry impacted communities. That can be an important exposure source if you live in one of those areas. So as you've heard, it's nearly impossible to avoid PFAS exposure. And this is worrisome because studies have shown that the PFAS in your body today could be harming health. So this is largely a failure of chemical regulation that PFAS is so pervasive in our daily lives. Studies suggest that PFAS contamination found in drinking water in some communities may be harmful at these levels to our immune system. And therefore, several states have set more stringent limits on PFAS in drinking water compared to EPA's advisory guideline. For example, the state of New Jersey has set more protective levels for several PFAS, including a health-based regulatory limit based on immune system suppression for PFOS. So again, as vaccines are becoming approved, it will be important for people to be vaccinated to save lives. And as we've described, it's very well known that PFAS exposure impacts our immune system, and therefore the CDC has recognized that research is needed to understand if PFAS in the body impairs vaccine response. And since nearly every American has PFAS already in their blood, this research will be critical. And this is something that will be important for everyone to know. So during this pandemic and every other day, it's important that people are informed about PFAS exposures in their daily lives. At the household level, there are certain behaviors that you can practice to a certain extent to reduce your levels of PFAS, including reducing the use of consumer products that contain PFAS, reducing eating takeout food or packaged foods in PFAS-lined containers. And we also encourage people to research their drinking water and to use a water filter in their home to reduce those exposures. But to address the PFAS contamination crisis, a much wider effort is needed. This includes ending non-essential uses and also reducing industrial discharges. So next, I'll turn to Melanie Benesh to talk more about the federal regulations that are needed to protect public health.
Thank you, Tasha, and thank you to all three of our guest experts today. I will be very quick and will then open it up to your questions, which I'm sure you have many. I just want to emphasize that the global COVID-19 pandemic has really underscored the importance of having healthy, functional immune systems. I think that's clear to everyone. And because of the known links between PFAS chemicals and immune system harm, the federal government should be doing everything possible to reduce our exposure to PFAS chemicals. And broadly, that means taking action to reduce industrial discharges into the environment, as Tasha said, ending any non-essential uses of PFAS and eliminating that exposure route, cleaning up all of the existing pollution that has been in the environment for decades, and getting PFAS out of our drinking water. And with that, I will, if you have any questions, you can just click on where it says participants at the bottom of the screen, and you should see an option to raise your hand. And I will keep an eye out for any raised hands and take any questions. R. Carlin.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Rick Carlin here, Times Union, Albany, New York. 22.5 micrograms per liter, that's the acceptable amount?
So that's nanograms per mil. So nanograms per milliliter.
How does that compare to micrograms per liter?
I would have to do the conversion online. I don't know if anybody else can do the conversion more quickly. It's the metric system. We're not educated.
Oh, so this is the metric. Okay.
Yeah, so nanograms per milliliter, nanograms per mil, I think is parts per trillion.
Parts per billion.
Parts per billion. See, I knew Dr. Birnbaum would have it.
Parts per billion?
Mm-hmm. Well, wait a minute. A part per billion is a nanogram per liter. So Jamie, I think you need to check your numbers there.
I'll look. It's nanograms per mil. That is the actual level that I got.
Well, that would be micrograms per liter, which would be parts per billion.
So 22.5 micrograms per liter is the same as 22.5 nanograms per mil.
Correct.
Oh, okay. Because I know here in New York, they were talking about the people in Hoosick Falls, New York, which has had a PFAS problem. They initially had 75 micrograms per liter, and now it's down to 40, but that's still quite a bit higher than 22.
That's the point.
Yeah. Okay. So, and their figures, according to the state, was that the U.S. average is about 2.08
for one specific PFAS.
Right.
But the point is, we're all, I mean, the CDC is routinely measuring now about 11. They actually measure for about 16, but they routinely find about 11 of them in all of us, but that's only what they're looking for.
Okay.
And
so, okay. I just want to get the nomenclature clear, that the numerology, the micrograms per liter, because that's
correct.
Right, in the U.S.
Yeah, and it's parts per billion.
Okay, that's it. So what do you tell someone if you live in Hoosick Falls, New York, or the Fear River area? What do you tell someone that lives
Well, I think I think that Dr. Stoiber gave us some suggestions
Yeah.
about certain things you could do to try to reduce your exposure. I
Mhm.
know in some areas like Hoosick Falls, I believe the people are being provided with bottled water,
Right,
right. You know, to reduce their consumption. It's really hard, to tell people now not to, you know, have takeout food during the pandemic. Yeah. Many of us are doing a lot of that, and it's right. Tremendously increased the amount of some, not all of it obviously has PFAS in it, but some of it certainly does, but it certainly also increased the amount of plastics and styrofoam that are going to the environment, which is not a good thing. And we do know that people who eat more fast food have higher levels of PFAS in their bodies.
Yeah, they've just banned some of the PFAS in food packaging here in New York State.
Yes, Governor Cuomo signed something just at the beginning of the month that banned all PFAS in food packaging, which is great. Yes. Sorry, Melanie.
That's okay. Our next question is from Sandy Lamott of CNN. Go ahead, Sandy.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. When do you think the CDC is going to finish these studies in connection to COVID and PFAS?
Dr. Birnbaum?
So what I'm not sure of is I know that they are going to be looking at this in their PFAS health studies that they're doing. The only one of those studies that I think is actually ongoing so far is the one in Peace, New Hampshire. The other 7 studies I'm not sure have actually been started yet. There's been some holdups with OMB. CDC is routinely measuring PFAS in their biannual report card that they do, the biomonitoring of the human population. And it would be great if they would, in those 10,000 people, if they would also get the information on COVID response in those people. But I think their specific study has to do with these 8 health studies that have been funded through the Department of Defense to look at 8 sites around the United States with elevated PFAS contamination.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Thanks. So there's so many different factors that seem to be putting people at higher risk for COVID. Obesity, almost every single kind of existing, confounding disease, all the way from pregnancy, age, just so many. How are we going to be able to tease out the piece that PFAS provides to that? And can you speculate on how PFAS, based on what you know about it, might be contributing to how it affects those different conditions in their response to COVID?
So I'll start with that because I just gave a talk on that actually. And the fact is that almost all of the risk factors other than age are related to things that PFAS has the ability to do. So if you talk about PFAS can increase the risk of many of your chronic non-communicable diseases like obesity, like diabetes, like some, as Dr. DeWitt told us, for example, asthma with your increased immune stimulation. PFAS has also been associated, with many of the health effects that do increase our risk for this. So the point is will we be able to tease it out? And the answer is, I think that there are statistical approaches that can be used if we have large enough observational human studies. We also have some information that we can use, as I said before, using what we know from our experimental studies can inform how we look at the human data as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to support what Dr. Birnbaum said about experimental studies. We can use studies of cells, we can use studies of experimental animals to isolate those other effects that are related to PFAS exposure, or we know are caused by PFAS exposure, because with experimental models, we could administer known concentrations of specific PFAS. So that helps us to cement those findings that we observe from studies of people who have been exposed.
And I would also just add that there are certain unique populations like firefighters, like service members who, because of either things they have used, like their gear or foam that contain a lot of PFAS, or just living near places where a lot of firefighting foam has been released. These are unique populations that have higher incidences of PFAS in their blood, and are also exposed to other environmental chemicals that may put them more at risk for some of these other chronic health effects, and may put them, may make their immune systems more compromised. The next question we have is from Nikki Hauser.
Hi, yes, you guys answered half of my question, but the other half is for Dr. DeWitt, specifically about Eastern Carolina. Do you know what communities here are most susceptible to PFAS and why?
Well, I think you understand that the Wilmington community has an increased risk of exposure because they're downstream from a floral manufacturing facility in Fayetteville that is owned by the Chemours company. And so all those people living downstream from that facility are being exposed. But we also understand that there are some communities in central North Carolina that also have increased exposures, possibly due to atmospheric transport of PFAS, possibly to do with application of biosolids from wastewater treatment facilities that do receive waste containing PFAS. So in terms of populations within the state, I think we're starting to understand what populations there are, but they're growing in number every day. We get new information on concentrations in water. And I don't know if Dr. Birnbaum had anything additional to add about that.
Yeah, so some of what we're finding is municipal wastewater can have very high levels of PFAS in it. And this has contaminated another river system that actually eventually leads into the Cape Fear system, but the Haw River system in North Carolina, with levels of PFAS in the municipal water supply in a small town as high as Cape Fear and higher actually. And the people in that town have blood levels that are similar to the levels that have been reported in Cape Fear. But in many parts of the country now, we're finding that municipal wastewater is often highly contaminated. Dr. DeWitt mentioned the issue of biosolids being used on farm fields. And we know there have been at least 2 episodes in Maine where dairy cows and all their produce have had to be destroyed because of high levels of PFAS in them.
Thank you.
And then we got a question in the chat from Steve Devane with the Fayetteville Observer. What action should folks who have been exposed to Gen X and similar compounds in North Carolina take to protect against COVID? And is there anything they can do before they take the vaccine or afterwards? Thank you.
Well, I can give an attempt at answering this. I think anybody who is living in this world right now needs to take appropriate precautions, regardless of who you are or where you live. Wear a mask when you're out in public, social distance, wash your hands frequently, perform all those behaviors that have been recommended to reduce your exposure to PFAS. If you live in an area where there's known PFAS, or to reduce your exposure to COVID. If you live in an area with known concentrations of PFAS, be even more diligent about washing your hands, wearing a mask, and social distancing, and try to avoid coming into contact with people who may increase your risk of contracting COVID.
And if you're in North Carolina, you can get an app on your cell phone, which will tell you if you have come in contact with people, in fact, who have had COVID or have the virus.
The next question is from Greg Barnes. Greg, are you there? Okay, then we got another question in the chat from R. Carlin again. Should residents of areas with known PFAS contamination get preference in getting COVID vaccine sooner or earlier?
That's really a major public health question. I think that we don't know. You know, there are a number of spots where we know we might have elevated PFAS, but there are lots of areas that will have elevated PFAS that we don't know. EWG now estimates that over 200 million people in the US are drinking water contaminated with PFAS, and that's just one source. So I think following the recommendations that healthcare workers and residents and caretakers in nursing homes are among the first is a very appropriate scheme for the vaccination response. And I think all of us are very eager that we fall in line and know where our priority will be as soon as possible. And of course, every state is prioritizing within some general guidelines quite differently.
We're just going to take a couple more questions. John Flesher from the Associated Press says, to be clear, what are you comfortable saying definitively at this point about the effects of PFAS on COVID severity or the effectiveness of COVID vaccines? Is anything known for sure, or is it all under study?
Well, I think we can't say anything definitively at this point because those relationships, other than the study by Dr. Grandjean and those that are currently being prepared for publication, haven't cemented that link yet. Dr. Grandjean's study demonstrated that there was an increased severity from exposure to PFBA or levels of PFBA in people's serum. I think that the risk is real, but we can't put definitive numbers on those risks right now. And I don't know if Dr. Birnbaum or Dr. Stoiber would have something different to say.
No, I would agree. I think that there is certainly conceptually from everything that we know about these chemicals, we know that they do suppress the immune system as well as stimulate it in certain cases. We know that if you have higher levels, you're more likely to have that suppression happening. And we know that suppression of the immune system can be associated with a decreased ability to mount a therapeutic response to vaccination. That doesn't mean you don't get any response to vaccination. You may just not get as much. So there may be opportunities that if you're living in an area, for example, and you know that you have high PFAS, there may be opportunities, maybe that instead of getting that one booster that's now required with the 2 mRNA vaccines, that maybe you would need a third booster. There are ways that people can have their antibody levels measured. So people after vaccination, a couple months later, can go and find out whether they have had a successful response. And again, and I think Dr. DeWitt may want to comment, but we know that there are now several different kinds of vaccines that are in the pipeline. We have the 2 mRNA vaccines, one which now is being injected, and hopefully by next week, the other will also be going into people. But we have several more traditional kinds of vaccines, protein-based vaccines that will be coming through within the next couple of months. And it may be that some people will respond better to one type than another.
So we just have time for one more question. If you have a question that was not answered today, please feel free to follow up with Monica Amarello, monica@ewg.org, and she will try to get you answers to your questions. So the last question we have is from Chantal Riley at PBS saying, can you please talk about what we know so far about the incoming Biden administration's plans to address PFAS contamination? So we do know something about the Biden-Harris administration's plans to address PFAS because they were the first major campaign to include specifics about PFAS chemical in their environmental justice plan. And so in their environmental justice plan, they had 4 components of things that they would do to address PFAS contamination. One was addressing PFAS chemicals under CERCLA, also known as the Superfund Law, which would really jumpstart the cleanup process at many different contaminated sites throughout the US, really cleaning up that legacy pollution that Dr. Birnbaum talked about in her presentation. The second thing that's addressed in the Biden-Harris Environmental Justice Plan is getting PFAS out of drinking water and finally setting a national drinking water standard for PFAS chemicals. The third is using the government's procurement power to stop buying some of those non-essential uses, which came up a couple of times today. These are the ways, the myriad ways that PFAS are used where we really just don't need them in food packaging, in cosmetics and carpeting. And so using the government's purchasing power to just stop buying those things that are needless exposures to PFAS chemicals. And the last is investing in more research like the kind that we talked about on our panel today, answering some of those unknown questions about PFAS exposure, about health risks, and about some of the other thousands of PFAS chemicals that we know are out there, but which we don't have quite as much information about as we do of some of the PFAS that were discussed in our panel today. So once again, I want to extend a really warm thank you, sincere thank you to Dr. Linda Birnbaum, Dr. Jamie DeWitt, Dr. Tasha Stoiber for sharing their expertise with us today. Thank you so much to so many members of the press for showing up today. Really appreciate your interest in this topic. And if we were not able to answer your question, please feel free to follow up with Monica. Thank you.